The sound of rain pattering against the window was oddly soothing as I sat at the kitchen table, staring at my wife, Sarah. She was stunning, as always, her dark hair falling in waves over her shoulders, her eyes bright and full of life. But beneath that familiar, beautiful exterior, there was something else, something cold, calculating. The very thought that I might be imagining it made me sick to my stomach. But I couldn't ignore the creeping suspicion that had gnawed at me for months now. It all started innocuously enough. Sarah's late nights at work, the unexplained absences, the sudden need to take weekend trips to visit her sister, whom she had barely mentioned in years. At first, I wanted to believe her. I needed to believe her. We had been married for 10 years, after all. We had built a life together, shared dreams, and even survived some pretty rough patches. But something in her voice had changed. A subtle shift that I only noticed because I was listening so closely. There was one night in particular that stands out in my mind. The night when doubt became certainty. I had been out with some friends, one of whom, Mark, was someone Sarah had always seemed particularly fond of. Nothing strange about that. Mark was charming, handsome, and had been a friend of mine long before Sarah came into the picture. But that night, something in the way Sarah greeted me when I got home set off alarms in my head. Her smile was too bright, her laughter too easy, and when I kissed her, there was a coldness on her lips that left me reeling. I didn't say anything then. I wasn't ready to face the possibility that the woman I loved more than anything might be betraying me. But the seed had been planted, and over the next few weeks it grew into something darker, something I couldn't ignore. One day, while Sarah was in the shower, I made a decision that would change everything. I had bought a small, discreet listening device, a bug, really, and I knew exactly where to hide it. Her purse, the one she took with her everywhere, seemed like the perfect place. My hands shook as I slipped it inside a small, seldom-used pocket, hoping she wouldn't notice the slight bulge. That night, as she prepared to leave for another supposed work event, I kissed her goodbye with a heaviness in my heart. Once she was out the door, I sank into the couch, my heart pounding as I connected the device to my phone. The first few minutes were nothing but the sound of her car engine, the radio playing softly in the background. But then, I heard her voice, low and conspiratorial, speaking to someone. "I'm on my way now. He has no idea, the fool," she said, a laugh in her voice that I didn't recognize. My blood ran cold. Who was she talking to? What was this about? I could feel my world crumbling around me, but I couldn't stop listening. I had to know. She met with someone, that much was clear. But the voice on the other end of the line was distorted, muffled by the car noise and the poor quality of the connection. They spoke in vague terms, but it was enough to know that whoever she was meeting, it wasn't work-related. When she hung up, I sat there in silence, my mind racing. For days, I replayed that conversation in my head, trying to piece together what it all meant. I watched her more closely than ever, looking for signs, anything that could confirm what I already knew in my heart. And then the eavesdropping became a routine. Every time she left the house, I would listen, desperate for any shred of information that might lead me to the truth. The more I listened, the more my suspicions grew. I heard her flirtatious laughter, her teasing words, and worst of all, the unmistakable intimacy in her tone when she spoke to someone other than me. But who was it? The voice on the other end was always indistinct, never clear enough to identify. Then one day, everything changed. She was on the phone again, talking in that same hushed, secretive tone. But this time, something was different. There was a familiarity in the other person's voice that sent a jolt through my body. I strained to hear, to catch every word. "I'll see you tonight," the voice said. It was distorted, but there was no mistaking the timbre, the cadence. I froze, my blood turning to ice as realization dawned on me. I knew that voice. It was Mark. The same Mark who had been my friend for years, who had shared beers with me, laughed with me, supported me through thick and thin. The same Mark who had always seemed just a little too interested in my wife. My hands trembled as I turned off the connection, my mind reeling. I felt sick, betrayed not just by Sarah, but by my closest friend. The two people I trusted most in the world were conspiring behind my back, and I was left to unravel the pieces of my life alone. That night, as Sarah slept peacefully beside me, I lay awake, my mind racing with plans, with thoughts of revenge, with the bitter taste of betrayal burning in my throat. I knew I couldn't confront them yet. Not until I had all the evidence. Not until I could look them both in the eyes and see their guilt reflected back at me. But soon, very soon, the truth would come to light. And when it did, there would be no mercy. The next morning I could hardly look at Sarah. She hummed cheerfully as she prepared breakfast, oblivious to the storm brewing inside me. Every smile she flashed in my direction felt like a dagger to the heart, a cruel reminder of the deceit hiding behind those perfect white teeth. How many times had she smiled like that after being with him? The thought made me nauseous. I kept my distance, pretending to be preoccupied with work as I sipped my coffee. The idea of her touching me now felt repulsive, knowing she had been with Mark. How could she act so normal, as if nothing had changed, as if she hadn't shattered my entire world? As the days passed, I became obsessed with the idea of catching them in the act. It wasn't enough to suspect, to hear their flirtatious banter over the bug in her purse. I needed to see it, to confront them with undeniable proof. I started leaving work early, lurking around places I knew Sarah frequented, hoping to catch a glimpse of her with Mark. But they were careful, too careful, and I found nothing. Then, one afternoon as I was driving home, my phone buzzed. It was a message from Sarah. "Working late again? Don't wait up. Love you." The lie was blatant, almost mocking in its simplicity. My stomach churned with a mix of anger and desperation. This was it. Tonight, I would follow her. I would finally have the proof I needed. I waited until she left, then grabbed my keys and followed her at a safe distance. She drove across town, taking an unusually convoluted route, as if to throw off any potential pursuers. My hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, my heart pounding in my chest as I tailed her through the darkened streets. Finally, she pulled into a small, secluded parking lot behind a nondescript building. I parked a few spaces away, my breath hitching as I watched her get out of the car. She glanced around nervously before walking towards the entrance, her high heels clicking against the pavement. There was no mistaking the anticipation in her step. I waited a few minutes before getting out of my car. My hands were shaking as I approached the building, a nondescript two-story structure with tinted windows. I recognized it as a cheap motel, the kind of place people go to when they don't want to be seen. My stomach twisted with revulsion as I realized how long this had probably been going on. Steeling myself, I slipped into the building, careful to avoid the front desk. The halls were dimly lit, and the smell of stale air and cheap cleaning products assaulted my senses. I had no idea which room she was in, but I was determined to find out. As I crept down the hallway, my heart hammered in my chest. I could hear the faint murmur of voices behind the closed doors, each one a potential revelation. My mind raced with scenarios. Would I burst in on them in the middle of something? Could I even stomach the sight of them together? But the need for truth, for undeniable proof, drove me forward. Then I heard it. A soft laugh, unmistakably Sarah's, followed by a hushed male voice. My heart stopped. The sound was coming from just behind the door to room 214. I stood there, frozen, every muscle in my body tensed as I listened. The conversation was muffled, but I could make out bits and pieces. They were laughing, talking about me. The anger bubbled up inside me like a volcano threatening to erupt. How dare they? How could they laugh and joke while stabbing me in the back? I leaned in closer, pressing my ear to the door, desperate to hear more. Their voices grew louder, more distinct. Sarah was speaking now, her tone sultry, the way she used to talk to me when we first started dating. But it wasn't meant for me. It was for him. "I don't know how much longer I can keep this up," she said, her voice tinged with annoyance. "He's getting suspicious." "Don't worry, babe," Mark replied, his voice dripping with confidence. "We just need a little more time. Soon we'll be rid of him, and you'll have everything you've ever wanted." My breath caught in my throat. The words hit me like a freight train. Not only were they betraying me, but they were planning something more sinister. What did Mark mean by getting rid of me? What were they plotting? The fear and anger coursing through my veins threatened to overwhelm me, but I forced myself to stay calm, to listen. "I just want this to be over," Sarah continued, her voice softer now. "He's so pathetic. I can hardly stand being around him anymore." I swallowed the bile that rose in my throat. The woman I had loved for a decade, the woman I had trusted with everything, was sitting in a cheap motel room with my best friend, plotting my downfall and mocking me behind my back. The realization was almost too much to bear. Mark laughed, a low, sinister sound that sent chills down my spine. "It will be soon. Just keep playing the loving wife a little longer, and then we'll make sure he never bothers you again." I couldn't listen anymore. My hands were trembling, my vision blurred by the rage coursing through me. I backed away from the door, my mind racing with thoughts of confrontation, of revenge. But I knew I wasn't ready. Not yet. I needed more proof, more time to plan my next move. As I stumbled out of the motel, the cold night air hit me like a slap in the face. I barely made it to my car before collapsing against the steering wheel, my breath coming in ragged gasps. How had it come to this? How had I been so blind? But I couldn't afford to wallow in self-pity. Not now. Not when my very life might be at stake. I had to be smart. Had to think like them. They had underestimated me, taken me for a fool. But they would soon learn just how wrong they were. With renewed determination, I started the car and drove home, my mind already formulating a plan. I would play the part of the clueless husband a little longer, just like Sarah wanted. I would give them enough rope to hang themselves, and when the time was right, I would make my move. The game was on, and I intended to win. The next few days were a blur of careful planning and emotional restraint. Every interaction with Sarah felt like walking a tightrope. I had to act normal, to pretend that nothing had changed, even as my mind churned with the knowledge of her betrayal. It was the hardest thing I had ever done, smiling at her, kissing her, pretending to care when every fiber of my being screamed at me to confront her, to demand answers. But I held back. I had to. I couldn't risk tipping my hand before I had everything I needed. Sarah was more affectionate than usual, which only made the charade more unbearable. She would lean into me, her hand resting lightly on my shoulder as she spoke, her lips brushing my ear when she whispered sweet nothings that now sounded like poison. I wanted to recoil, to shove her away, but I forced myself to smile, to act as if nothing was wrong. She even suggested we go out for dinner one evening, just the two of us, to rekindle the romance. The irony was almost laughable. I agreed, of course, though the thought of sitting across from her in a restaurant making small talk while knowing she was planning my demise was nearly more than I could bear. The night of our dinner arrived, and I played the part of the doting husband to perfection. We went to our favorite restaurant, the one where we had celebrated our anniversary the previous year. It was a cozy little place with dim lighting and soft music, exactly the kind of place that made it easy to pretend everything was normal. Sarah was stunning, as always, dressed in a sleek black dress that hugged her curves, her hair cascading in waves down her back. She smiled at me, her eyes sparkling with that familiar warmth that had once made me feel like the luckiest man in the world. But now all I could see was the cold, calculating woman behind that beautiful facade. We made small talk, discussing work, friends, the usual topics. I nodded and smiled in all the right places, but my mind was elsewhere, plotting my next move. The bug in her purse had continued to yield valuable information, though nothing as damning as what I had overheard in that motel. I had to be patient, to wait for the perfect moment to strike. As the evening wore on, Sarah reached across the table and took my hand, her fingers warm against mine. She looked at me with an expression of such sincerity that, for a brief moment, I almost doubted everything. Could it all be in my head? Was it possible that I had misunderstood? That there was some explanation for everything? But then I remembered Mark's voice, the way they had laughed at my expense, the sinister undertones of their conversation. The doubt evaporated as quickly as it had come. "I'm so glad we're doing this," Sarah said softly, her thumb stroking the back of my hand. "I've missed us, Tom. I know things have been a bit distant lately, but I want to make things right. I love you." The words were like acid, burning through whatever was left of my affection for her. I smiled, though it felt more like a grimace, and squeezed her hand gently. "I love you too, Sarah," I replied, the lie rolling off my tongue with surprising ease. Her smile widened and she leaned in, her voice dropping to a whisper. "How about we get out of here? We could go back home, have a nice bottle of wine, and—" Her suggestion trailed off, but the implication was clear. She wanted to seduce me, to lull me into a false sense of security. Maybe she thought that by throwing herself at me, she could erase the doubts she sensed, but didn't yet know were based on solid evidence. I forced a smile and nodded. That sounds perfect. We paid the bill and left the restaurant. Her arm looped through mine as we walked to the car. The air was cool, crisp, the kind of night that would have been perfect for a romantic stroll under different circumstances. But all I could think about was how to keep my facade intact while getting closer to the truth. When we arrived home, I poured us both a glass of wine, my mind working overtime as I considered my options. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that catching them in the act wasn't enough. I needed to turn the tables, to make them feel the betrayal and fear that had been gnawing at me for weeks. Sarah was in the bathroom when the idea hit me, a stroke of dark genius that would ensure they could never recover from what they had done. It was risky, but the potential payoff was too sweet to ignore. I would confront them, but not as a victim. I would be the one holding all the cards. The next day I made my preparations. I started by gathering every piece of evidence I had. Recordings from the bug, photos from their meetups, even some of the receipts from the motel. I compiled everything into a neat little file, a dossier of their treachery that would be impossible to refute. Then I called Mark. He answered on the second ring, his voice cheerful, as if nothing was amiss. "Tom, hey man, how's it going?" I forced a casual tone. "Hey Mark, not too bad. Listen, I was wondering if you could help me with something." "Sure thing. What's up?" "I've been planning a little surprise for Sarah," I lied, feeling a twisted sense of satisfaction as I fed him the bait. "I'm throwing her a small party for our anniversary. Just a few close friends. I was hoping you could come over early and help me set up." There was a brief pause, and I could almost hear the gears turning in his head. He didn't suspect a thing. "Of course, man. That sounds great. When should I come by?" "Tomorrow night, around 7? "Perfect. I'll be there." I thanked him and hung up, my heart racing with a mix of anticipation and dread. The trap was set. Now, all I had to do was wait. The next day passed in a haze of tension. Sarah was oblivious, going about her day as if nothing had changed, while I meticulously prepared for what was to come. I spent the afternoon setting up the house, making it look like I was indeed planning a romantic evening. Candles, flowers, a beautifully set dining table, the works. It was all part of the ruse. By the time 7 o'clock rolled around, I was more than ready. Sarah was upstairs getting ready, thinking we were going out for dinner. She had no idea what was about to unfold. The doorbell rang, and I opened it to find Mark standing there, a bottle of wine in hand, a grin on his face. "Ready to get this party started?" he asked, stepping inside. I closed the door behind him, my smile tight. "Absolutely. Let's go into the living room." He followed me, still clueless, as I led him to the couch. We sat down, and I could see the curiosity in his eyes as he glanced around, noting the romantic setup. "You really went all out," he said, sounding impressed. "Sarah's going to love this." I nodded, my heart pounding in my chest. "Yeah, I hope so. But before we get started, there's something I want to show you." Mark's brow furrowed slightly, but he nodded. "Sure. What is it?" I reached for the file I had prepared, my hand steady as I handed it to him. "Take a look at this." He took the file, his expression confused as he opened it. The moment he saw the contents, his face went pale. The color drained from his cheeks as he flipped through the photos, the receipts, the printed transcripts of their conversations. What is this?" he stammered, his eyes wide with shock. "It's everything," I said, my voice calm, almost cold. "Everything you and Sarah have been doing behind my back. All the lies, the cheating, the plotting. I know everything, Mark." He looked up at me, panic flashing in his eyes. "Tom, listen. I can explain." "Save it," I snapped, cutting him off. "I don't want your excuses. I just want you to understand that you're not in control anymore." "I am." He swallowed hard, his hands trembling as he clutched the file. "What do you want?" I leaned back, a small smile playing on my lips. "I want you both to pay, and you will. But first, we're going to have a little chat with Sarah." Mark's eyes widened, and he shook his head frantically. "No, please, Tom, don't." But it was too late. I stood up and called out to Sarah, my voice echoing through the house. "Sarah, come down here. There's something you need to see." The sound of her footsteps on the stairs was the only response. She appeared in the doorway a moment later, her expression curious as she saw us sitting in the living room. But when she saw the file in Mark's hands, her face drained of color. What's going on?" she asked, her voice shaky. I motioned for her to sit down. "We're having a little family meeting. Why don't you join us?" She hesitated, but the look in my eyes left her no choice. She sat down beside Mark, her hands trembling as she reached for the file. She didn't need to open it to know what it contained. Her guilty expression said it all. For a moment, the three of us sat in silence, the tension so thick it was almost suffocating. Then I spoke, my voice calm but laced with steel. "Now, Sarah, why don't you start by telling me exactly how long this has been going on?" Sarah's face paled, and her eyes darted nervously between me and Mark. For a moment, she looked like she might try to deny everything. But as she glanced at the file in her hands, the weight of the evidence seemed to crush any hope of escape. She looked down, her shoulders slumping, as she realized there was no way out. "Tom," she began, her voice trembling, I never meant for it to get this far." I said nothing, just watched her, my gaze hard as I waited for her to continue. Mark sat beside her, looking like a trapped animal, his usually confident demeanor crumbling under the pressure. "It started a few months ago," she continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "At first it was just harmless flirting. You were working late a lot and I was lonely. Mark was always around, always so attentive. It just happened." I felt a surge of anger, but I forced it down, keeping my expression neutral. "And then?" Sarah hesitated, her hands twisting nervously in her lap. "And then we slept together. It was just once, at first. I felt so guilty afterward I swore it would never happen again. But it did. It kept happening. We couldn't stop." I leaned forward, my voice low and dangerous. "How long?" She flinched at the venom in my tone, but answered nonetheless. 4 months. Maybe 5. I lost track. "Lost track," I repeated, the words bitter on my tongue. "And what about the others? Was it just Mark? Or were there more?" Her eyes widened in shock and she shook her head frantically. No, it was just Mark, I swear." Mark, who had been silent until now, suddenly spoke up, his voice pleading. "Tom, listen, we never wanted to hurt you. It just got out of hand." I turned my gaze to him, my eyes cold. "Out of hand? That's an understatement, don't you think? You two didn't just cheat. You conspired. You planned to get rid of me." Mark paled, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. He had no words, no defense. They both knew there was no way to justify what they had done. Sarah looked at me, her eyes brimming with tears. "Tom, please. You have to believe me. We never meant to hurt you. We were stupid. I was stupid." I let out a bitter laugh, the sound harsh in the tense silence. "Stupid? That's the best you can come up with? You betrayed me with my best friend, lied to my face and plotted behind my back. And you call that stupidity?" She reached out as if to touch me, but I recoiled. The sight of her hand disgusted me. "Please, Tom," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." For a moment, I felt a pang of something. Maybe it was pity. Maybe it was the remnants of the love I had once felt for her. But it was quickly smothered by the overwhelming anger and betrayal that consumed me. "Sorry doesn't cut it," I said coldly. "Not anymore." She recoiled as if I had slapped her, tears streaming down her face. "I know," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I know I've destroyed everything. I don't expect you to forgive me. I just want you to understand that I never wanted this to happen. I never wanted to hurt you." "Then why did you do it?" I demanded, my voice rising despite my efforts to remain calm. "Why, Sarah? Was I not enough for you? Did you need more excitement? More—" "What?" She shook her head, sobbing openly now. "I don't know," she cried. "I don't know, Tom. I was just so lost. I felt like we were drifting apart and Mark was there and I made a mistake. A terrible mistake." I stood up, unable to sit still any longer. The anger was boiling over, and I needed to move, to do something, anything, to keep from losing control completely. I paced the room, my mind racing. Mark watched me, his face a mask of fear. "Tom, please," he started, but I cut him off with a sharp gesture. "Don't," I snapped. "Just don't." He fell silent, his shoulders slumping in defeat. I stopped pacing and turned to face them both, my heart pounding in my chest. "You're both pathetic," I said, my voice dripping with contempt. "You destroyed everything, and for what? A few moments of pleasure? A thrill? You threw away our friendship, our marriage, for nothing." They both sat in silence, unable to meet my eyes. The weight of their guilt hung heavy in the air, suffocating. For a long moment, no one spoke. The only sound was Sarah's quiet sobs as she buried her face in her hands, her body shaking with the force of her tears. Mark sat beside her, staring at the floor, his face pale and drawn. Finally, I took a deep breath, trying to calm the storm of emotions raging inside me. I knew what I had to do, but it wasn't easy. Part of me wanted to scream at them, to throw them out of my house and out of my life forever. But another part of me, the part that was tired, broken, and defeated, just wanted it all to end. "You're going to leave," I said, my voice steady despite the turmoil inside me. "Both of you. You're going to walk out that door and you're not coming back. Ever." Sarah looked up, her tear-streaked face filled with despair. "Tom, please," she began, but I cut her off. "No," I said firmly. "It's over, Sarah. We're over. There's nothing left to say." She shook her head, the desperation in her eyes almost too much to bear. "But where will I go? What will I do?" "That's not my problem," I replied coldly. "You made your choice. Now you have to live with it." Mark stood up, his expression one of resignation. "Come on, Sarah," he said quietly. "Let's go." She looked at him, then back at me, as if searching for some sign of hope, some way to fix what she had broken. But there was nothing left to salvage. With a sob, she stood up, clutching the file of evidence against her chest as if it were a lifeline. Mark took her arm, guiding her towards the door. She paused in the doorway, turning to look at me one last time. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I'm so sorry." I said nothing, just stared at her, my heart a cold, heavy weight in my chest. With a final, defeated sob, she turned and followed Mark out the door. I watched them leave, the door closing behind them with a soft click that seemed to echo through the empty house. For a long time, I just stood there, staring at the door, my mind numb. I had won, but it didn't feel like a victory. It felt like the end of everything. The silence in the house was deafening, a stark contrast to the turmoil that had filled it just moments before. I could still hear Sarah's sobs in my mind, could still see the look of despair on her face as she realized everything was lost. But I didn't feel any satisfaction, any sense of closure, only emptiness. I had lost my wife, my best friend, my life as I knew it. And now, all I had left was the cold comfort of knowing the truth. I sank down onto the couch, burying my face in my hands as the weight of it all finally crashed down on me. The anger, the betrayal, the pain. It was all too much. For the first time since I had discovered their affair, I allowed myself to break down, to let the tears flow freely. I had been strong for so long, had held it all together when everything around me was falling apart. But now, in the silence of the empty house, I let it all out. The sobs racked my body, my tears soaking into the fabric of the couch as I mourned the life I had lost, the love that had been destroyed. Eventually the tears subsided, leaving me drained and hollow. I sat there for what felt like hours, staring blankly ahead, trying to process everything that had happened. The house felt like a tomb, the silence oppressive, the darkness closing in around me. I knew I couldn't stay here, not tonight, not after everything. I needed to get out, to breathe, to clear my head. Without thinking, I grabbed my keys and walked out the door, not caring where I was going, just knowing I couldn't stay. As I drove through the darkened streets, my mind drifted, replaying the events of the night over and over again. I had gotten what I wanted. Sarah and Mark were out of my life. But at what cost? The price of the truth had been everything I held dear. I drove aimlessly, lost in thought, until I found myself parked outside a bar. It was a place I had never been before, a small, dingy dive with a neon sign that flickered in the night. It seemed as good a place as any to drown my sorrows. I walked inside, the dim lighting and stale smell of cigarettes and beer hitting me like a wall. The bartender gave me a nod as I took a seat at the bar, ordering a whiskey on the rocks. The first sip burned on its way down, but the warmth that followed was a welcome distraction from the cold emptiness inside me. I sat there, nursing my drink, as the weight of everything that had happened pressed down on me. The anger and betrayal still simmered beneath the surface. But now, in the quiet of the bar, a new feeling began to creep in. Grief. I had lost everything. My wife, my best friend, my entire life as I knew it. And now, as I stared into the amber liquid in my glass, I realized that there was no going back. The life I had once known was gone, shattered beyond repair. As the night wore on, and the whiskey flowed, the anger and bitterness began to fade, replaced by a deep, aching sadness. I didn't know what the future held, didn't know how I was going to move forward from this. But one thing was certain: nothing would ever be the same again. The next morning I woke up in my car with a pounding headache and the bitter taste of whiskey still clinging to my tongue. The bar was a blur, and I couldn't remember how I'd ended up back in the parking lot, slumped over the steering wheel like a man who'd lost everything, which, in many ways, I had. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting a dull gray light over the world. I sat there for a moment, my mind blank, as the events of the previous night slowly came back to me. The confrontation with Sarah and Mark, the tears, the confessions, it all felt like a bad dream. But the emptiness inside me was real, a cold reminder that nothing had been a dream. I forced myself to sit up, wincing as the motion sent a sharp pain through my skull. I needed to get home, to figure out what came next. But the thought of returning to that empty house, filled with memories of the life I'd once had, made me sick. I wasn't ready to face it yet. Instead, I drove aimlessly through the quiet streets, trying to clear my head. The city was just beginning to wake up, the early morning commuters starting their day, oblivious to the turmoil that had consumed mine. I envied them, their normalcy, their lives untouched by betrayal and deceit. Eventually, I found myself parked at the edge of a park, a place Sarah and I had visited often in happier times. The sight of the familiar walking paths, the trees swaying gently in the breeze, brought a wave of memories crashing over me. But instead of the pain I expected, I felt something else, a steely resolve beginning to form. I had let Sarah and Mark walk out of my house last night, but I wasn't done with them. Not by a long shot. They had taken everything from me. My trust, my love, my sense of security, and now I would take something from them. The idea of revenge was like a spark in the darkness, a small flame that quickly grew into an all-consuming fire. I didn't want to just move on, to let them go and rebuild my life. I wanted them to pay. I wanted them to suffer, to feel the same pain and betrayal that they had inflicted on me. But I needed a plan. Something that would hit them where it hurt the most. Something that would leave them broken, just as they had left me. I spent the next few days in a fog of planning and preparation. Every spare moment was devoted to figuring out how best to execute my revenge. I barely ate, barely slept, my mind consumed with thoughts of retribution. It was the only thing that kept me going, the only thing that gave me any sense of purpose. I started by digging into Mark's life. He had always been careful, but everyone has secrets, and it didn't take long to find his. Mark's business dealings were less than legitimate. He'd been involved in some shady investments, the kind that could ruin a man if they ever came to light. He had always bragged about his success, about how he had made a small fortune by playing the game. But now, I had the pieces I needed to bring that empire crashing down. I began gathering evidence, just as I had done with Sarah's affair. Bank statements, emails, phone records. It was all there, hidden in plain sight if you knew where to look. I compiled it all into a neat little package, ready to hand over to the authorities at the right moment. But that was just the beginning. Sarah was next. She had always been vain, obsessed with her appearance, her reputation. The idea of public humiliation, of being exposed as the lying, cheating woman she was, would devastate her. I knew just how to exploit that. I went through her social media, gathering every incriminating photo, every message that hinted at her infidelity. I created a dossier of her affair with Mark, complete with timestamps, locations, and even the recordings from the bug in her purse. It was a damning collection, one that would leave no doubt about what she had done. But I didn't stop there. I wanted more. I wanted to destroy her completely, to leave her with nothing. I started digging into her finances, her personal life, anything I could use to make her suffer. And as I did, I discovered something interesting. Sarah had been siphoning money from our joint accounts for months, slowly transferring funds to a private account I hadn't known existed. She had been planning to leave me long before I had caught on to her affair. The discovery filled me with a cold fury, but it also gave me another weapon to use against her. I took note of the account details, ready to bring it all crashing down at the right moment. With everything in place, I was ready to set my plan in motion. The first step was to make sure Sarah and Mark were aware that I wasn't just going to fade away. I wanted them to feel the pressure, to know that something was coming, even if they didn't know what it was yet. I started with Sarah. I sent her an anonymous email, attaching some of the more incriminating evidence I had gathered. The message was simple. I know everything. This is just the beginning. The response was immediate. Within hours, she called me, her voice shaking with fear and desperation. "Tom, please," she begged. "I'm sorry. I know I hurt you, but you don't have to do this. Please, just let me explain." I listened to her pleas, my heart cold and unmoved. "You made your choice, Sarah," I said, my voice flat. "Now you'll have to live with the consequences." She tried to argue, to reason with me, but I ended the call, leaving her in the dark, knowing she was probably imagining all the ways her life was about to fall apart. Next, I turned my attention to Mark. I sent him a similar message, this time attaching some of the documents that detailed his illegal activities. "Time's up, Mark. You're going to pay for what you've done." His response was less frantic than Sarah's, but I could hear the fear in his voice when he called me. "Tom, let's talk about this. We can work something out." "There's nothing to work out," I replied coolly. "You ruined my life, and now I'm going to ruin yours." He tried to play it off, to pretend he wasn't scared, but I could hear the panic underlying his bravado. "You don't have to do this, Tom. It doesn't have to end this way." "Oh, but it does," I said, a small smile playing on my lips as I hung up the phone. I knew they were both scared, both scrambling to figure out what to do next. They probably thought they could still talk me down, that they could convince me to let it all go. But they were wrong. The next few days were a waiting game. I watched from a distance as their lives began to unravel. Sarah stopped going to work, too terrified to face the world. Mark became paranoid, constantly looking over his shoulder, waiting for the hammer to drop. Then, just as they thought things couldn't get any worse, I made my move. I started by leaking the information about Mark's illegal dealings to the authorities. I made sure it was anonymous, a tip from a concerned citizen who had stumbled upon something suspicious. The fallout was immediate. Mark's accounts were frozen, his assets seized. The news spread like wildfire, and within hours, his name was plastered all over the media, his reputation in tatters. Next, I turned my attention to Sarah. I leaked the details of her affair, along with the evidence I had gathered, to her co-workers, her friends, even her family. I made sure everyone knew what she had done, how she had betrayed me. The humiliation was devastating. She lost her job, her friends, her social standing. Everything she had cared about was ripped away in an instant. I watched it all unfold from the sidelines, a sense of grim satisfaction settling over me as I saw the destruction I had wrought. They had taken everything from me, and now I had taken everything from them. But as I stood there, watching their lives crumble, I felt something else. A strange emptiness, a hollowness that no amount of revenge could fill. The anger, the hatred, the drive for retribution had consumed me for so long that I hadn't realized what I was losing in the process. As the days turned into weeks and the dust began to settle, I found myself standing in the ruins of my own life. Sarah and Mark were gone, their lives shattered beyond repair, but so was mine. I had won, but at what cost? The house was empty, the silence oppressive. The memories of what had been and what could have been haunted me at every turn. The satisfaction of revenge had faded, leaving only a deep, aching void. In the end, I had destroyed everything, including myself. I wasn't sure what the future held, or if there was even a future for me. But one thing was certain. Nothing would ever be the same again. The days after my final act of vengeance passed in a blur of aimless wandering. The once clear goal of making Sarah and Mark pay for their betrayal had been achieved, but the victory was hollow. The satisfaction I had expected to feel was absent, replaced instead by a deep, gnawing emptiness that seemed to grow with each passing day. I couldn't bear to stay in the house anymore. Every corner, every piece of furniture, every photo on the wall was a reminder of the life I had destroyed, both theirs and mine. The silence, once comforting, now felt like a constant reminder of everything I had lost. So I left, packing a small bag and driving with no particular destination in mind, just the need to escape. I found myself in a small coastal town several hours away. It was the off-season, and the town was nearly deserted, with most of the shops and restaurants closed until the summer crowds returned. The emptiness suited me. I rented a small, shabby room in a motel overlooking the ocean, a place where I could be alone with my thoughts. The days blurred together as I drifted in and out of a fog of regret and self-loathing. I walked the empty beach for hours, the cold wind biting at my skin, the crashing waves drowning out the thoughts I couldn't escape. I had wanted revenge, and I had gotten it. But now, I couldn't stop thinking about the cost. Sarah's face haunted me, her tear-streaked cheeks, the look of despair in her eyes when she realized I had destroyed her life. I had wanted to see her suffer, but now that I had, all I felt was guilt. Had I gone too far? Had my need for retribution blinded me to the point of no return? The questions gnawed at me and I had no answers. Mark was no different. The man who had once been my best friend was now a broken shell of the confident, cocky person he had been. His reputation was ruined, his life in shambles. I had relished the thought of him losing everything. But now, I couldn't shake the image of him, defeated and hollow, as the reality of what I had done sank in. I had thought that by destroying them, I could somehow reclaim a part of what I had lost. But the truth was, nothing could bring back the life I had once had. I had been so consumed by my anger and hatred that I hadn't realized what I was really doing, tearing myself apart in the process. The days turned into weeks, and I continued to drift, both physically and mentally. I barely ate, barely slept, existing in a state of numbness that kept the worst of the pain at bay. But the regret, the deep, aching regret was always there, lurking just beneath the surface. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the ocean in shades of orange and pink, I found myself sitting on a rock overlooking the water. The beauty of the scene was lost on me, my mind still trapped in the darkness that had consumed me for so long. I pulled out my phone, scrolling aimlessly through old messages and photos. There were pictures of Sarah and me, smiling, happy, in love. Pictures of Mark, laughing with us, his arms slung around my shoulder as we celebrated some forgotten victory. The memories were too painful, and I quickly put the phone away, but the images lingered in my mind, refusing to be banished. I couldn't help but wonder what would have happened if I had handled things differently. What if I had confronted them calmly? Tried to understand why they had done what they did? What if I had walked away instead of letting the desire for revenge consume me? Would things be any different? Or was I destined to end up here, alone, broken, and filled with regret? The questions haunted me, but I knew they were pointless. I couldn't change the past, couldn't undo the damage I had done. All I could do was try to figure out how to move forward, though even that seemed impossible. That night, as I lay in the dark, listening to the sound of the waves crashing against the shore, I finally allowed myself to cry. It was the first time I had truly let go since the whole ordeal began, and the tears came in a torrent, releasing the pent-up emotions I had kept buried for so long. I cried for the love I had lost, for the friendships I had destroyed, for the man I had once been. I cried for the future that had been ripped away from me, for the life I would never have, and most of all, I cried for the realization that in the end, I had been my own worst enemy. When the tears finally stopped, I felt hollow, drained, but there was a strange sense of clarity as well. I had spent so much time focused on what I had lost, on the pain and betrayal, that I hadn't allowed myself to think about what came next. But now, I realized that I had a choice. I could continue down this path of self-destruction, wallowing in regret and bitterness. Or I could try to find a way to rebuild. It wouldn't be easy. Nothing about this situation was. But for the first time, I allowed myself to believe that maybe, just maybe, there was still a chance for something better. The next morning, I woke up with a sense of purpose I hadn't felt in weeks. It wasn't much, just a small spark of determination, but it was enough to get me out of bed, to start thinking about the future. I spent the day making plans, small steps toward rebuilding my life. I called my lawyer, setting the wheels in motion for the sale of the house. There was no way I could ever live there again, not after everything that had happened. I began looking for a new place to live, somewhere far away from the memories that haunted me. I also reached out to a therapist, someone who could help me navigate the mess I had made of my life. It was a small step, but it felt like a move in the right direction, a way to start healing the wounds I had inflicted on myself. As the days passed, the fog of regret slowly began to lift. I knew I had a long road ahead of me, that the pain and guilt would never fully go away, but I also knew that I had to try. I couldn't let the mistakes of the past define the rest of my life. It wasn't easy, and there were days when the weight of what I had done threatened to crush me, but I kept moving forward, one step at a time, determined to find some semblance of peace, to rebuild the pieces of my shattered life. Months passed, and slowly I began to heal. The house was sold, the money used to start fresh in a new city where no one knew my name or my past. The therapy sessions helped me unpack the anger and bitterness that had consumed me, to find healthier ways to deal with the pain. I never spoke to Sarah or Mark again. They had become ghosts, figures from a past life that I was trying to leave behind. I knew they had their own struggles, their own battles to fight, but I couldn't be a part of that anymore. I had to focus on myself, on finding a way to live with what I had done. In the end, I realized that revenge had been a poison, one that had nearly destroyed me. I had thought it would bring me closure, satisfaction, but all it had done was deepen the wounds and prolong the pain. The only way forward was to let go, to forgive myself for the mistakes I had made, and to try to build a life worth living. It wasn't the life I had once dreamed of, but it was something. And for the first time in a long time, that felt like enough. The seasons changed, and with them, so did I. The harsh winter gave way to a gentle spring, and as the world around me began to renew itself, I found that I, too, was beginning to heal. It wasn't an easy process. Healing never is. But the small steps I had taken were starting to add up. My new life in the city was quiet, almost solitary, but it was exactly what I needed. I found a small apartment on the outskirts of town, a place that was both modest and unassuming, a perfect contrast to the life I had left behind. It was far from the luxury I had once enjoyed, but it was mine, and that was enough. The therapist I'd started seeing was a lifeline, helping me navigate the storm of emotions that had been bottled up for so long. Through our sessions, I began to unpack the layers of anger, regret, and guilt that had built up inside me. I learned that the pain I was feeling wasn't just about Sarah and Mark's betrayal. It was also about the way I had betrayed myself in my quest for revenge. One day, during a particularly difficult session, my therapist asked me a question that cut right to the heart of the matter. "Tom, what do you want your life to look like now? What do you want to build for yourself?" The question took me by surprise. For so long I'd been focused on what I had lost, on the pain and the regret, that I hadn't even considered what came next. The thought of building something new, something just for myself, was both terrifying and liberating. "I don't know," I admitted, my voice shaky. "I haven't really thought about it." She nodded, her expression kind. "That's okay. It's natural to feel lost after everything you've been through. But now is the time to start thinking about the future. What would make you happy?" Happy. The word felt foreign on my tongue, as if it belonged to someone else. But as I sat there, thinking about it, I realized that there were things I wanted. Things I had pushed aside for so long because I didn't believe I deserved them. "I think I want to find peace," I said slowly, the words forming as I spoke. "I want to let go of all this anger and hurt and find a way to move forward. I want to feel whole again." She smiled gently. That's a good start. But remember, healing isn't just about letting go of the past. It's also about building something new, something that brings you joy. What are the things that bring you joy, Tom? The question hung in the air, and for a moment I didn't know how to answer. But then, memories began to surface. Of the things I had once loved, the hobbies and passions that had fallen by the wayside in the chaos of the last few years. I used to love writing, I said, almost to myself. I used to write stories, poems, anything that came to mind. It made me feel alive. Her eyes lit up. That's wonderful. Writing can be a powerful tool for healing. It allows you to express your emotions, to explore your thoughts and feelings in a way that's both creative and cathartic. Why don't you start writing again? It could be a way to reconnect with that part of yourself that you've lost. The idea intrigued me. I hadn't written anything in years, not since before Sarah and I got married. Life had gotten in the way, as it so often does, and my passion for writing had been buried under the responsibilities of work and marriage. But now, with nothing but time on my hands, it seemed like the perfect opportunity to rediscover that part of myself. That night, after the session, I sat down at the small desk in my apartment and opened a blank document on my laptop. The cursor blinked at me, expectant, and for a moment, I hesitated. But then, I started typing, the words flowing from me as if a dam had burst. At first, the writing was clumsy, awkward. I was rusty, out of practice. But I didn't let that stop me. I wrote about everything, about the pain of betrayal, the anger and bitterness that had consumed me, the regret that had lingered long after the dust had settled. But I also wrote about hope, about the possibility of something better, about the desire to rebuild and find peace. The more I wrote, the more the weight on my chest began to lift. It was as if each word, each sentence was a small step toward healing, a way to make sense of everything that had happened. I wrote late into the night, losing myself in the flow of words, until finally, exhausted but strangely satisfied, I closed the laptop and went to bed. The next morning I felt different, lighter somehow. It was a small change, but it was there, and I clung to it as a sign that maybe, just maybe, I was on the right path. I continued to write every day, making it a part of my routine. It became a ritual, a way to start each day with purpose. Some days the words came easily, and I wrote pages and pages. Other days it was a struggle to write even a single sentence. But I kept at it, knowing that the act of writing itself was what mattered, not the result. As the weeks turned into months, I began to feel more like myself again. The anger and bitterness that had once consumed me were still there, but they were no longer the driving force in my life. Instead, I was starting to focus on the future, on what I wanted to create for myself. I started to explore the city, finding small cafes where I could sit and write, discovering parks where I could walk and clear my head. I even joined a local writers group, a small but supportive community of people who shared my passion for storytelling. It was a way to connect with others, to share my work and receive feedback, and it felt good to be a part of something again. Through all of this, I continued my therapy, working through the layers of hurt and regret that still lingered. It wasn't easy. There were days when the old feelings of anger and betrayal would resurface, threatening to pull me back into the darkness. But I had learned how to manage them, how to acknowledge those feelings without letting them control me. One day, as I was walking through the park, I received an unexpected call. It was from a literary agent who had come across some of my writing online. They were interested in my work, wanted to discuss the possibility of publishing some of my stories. The news stunned me. I had been writing for myself, as a way to heal, but the idea that my work could reach others, that it could be something more, was both exhilarating and terrifying. I met with the agent, and before I knew it, I was signing a contract for a collection of short stories. It felt surreal, like a dream I had forgotten I wanted. But it also felt right, like the culmination of everything I had been working toward. As the publication date approached, I found myself reflecting on how far I had come. The man I had been, the one consumed by anger and revenge, felt like a distant memory. I had been through the worst and come out the other side, scarred but not defeated. The day the book was released, I stood in front of a small crowd at a local bookstore, reading from my collection. My hands trembled slightly as I spoke, but there was a sense of pride in my voice, a feeling of accomplishment that I hadn't felt in years. After the reading, as I signed copies of the book for the attendees, I realized something profound. I was no longer defined by the betrayal, the anger, or the revenge. I had found a way to move forward, to create something new, something that brought me joy. As the last person in line approached, I looked up and froze. It was Sarah. She stood there, holding a copy of my book, her eyes filled with an emotion I couldn't quite place. It had been nearly a year since I had last seen her, and the sight of her now, standing before me, brought a flood of memories rushing back. "Tom," she said softly, her voice tinged with sadness. I saw your book online, and I just wanted to say, I'm proud of you." I didn't know how to respond. There was a part of me that still hurt, that still held on to the anger and betrayal. But it was smaller now, quieter. I looked at her, really looked at her, and saw a woman who had made mistakes, who had hurt me deeply, but who was also trying to find her own way forward. "Thank you," I said finally, my voice calm. She handed me the book, and I signed it, writing her name with a steady hand. When I handed it back to her, our eyes met, and in that moment, I realized something important. I had forgiven her. It wasn't a dramatic revelation, more of a quiet acceptance. The past was the past, and while it had shaped who I was, it didn't have to define my future. I had let go of the need for revenge, for retribution, and in doing so, I had found peace. Sarah smiled sadly, and without another word, she turned and left the bookstore, leaving me standing there holding the pen that had just signed away the last of my anger. As I watched her walk away, I felt a sense of closure, a final chapter in a story that had once consumed me. But now, I was free to write a new story, one that was mine alone. I left the bookstore that evening with a light heart, the weight of the past finally lifted. The road ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, I felt ready to face whatever came next. And as I walked into the twilight, the words of my therapist echoed in my mind. "What do you want your life to look like now?" I didn't have all the answers yet, but I knew one thing for certain. I wanted to live a life of purpose, of creativity, of peace. A life where I could look back on the past not with regret, but with gratitude for the lessons it had taught me. And so, with the future wide open before me, I took the first step into my new beginning.